Blue FM. Blue FM, bringing generations together.
Welcome to the Weekend Transformation Show. My name is Sharon Antoni, and with me today is Pastor Brighton Mapokotera. Welcome, Pastor.
Thank you, Sharon. Thank you for hosting me.
Yes. Today we're going to be talking about the relationship between the Old Testament and the New Testament. Right. Pastor, we find Guti Kuma churches right. We are now doing the things that were written in the New Testament, and not in the Old Testament. Can you please relate to that?
Oh, thank you for that question, Sharon. You know, I actually discovered that in many views, most of the people, they are now dividing the Bible, taking the Old Testament as absolute, and the New Testament as the in thing, and they are saying we don't do anything that is in the Old Testament, which is not written in the New Testament. Yes. But I think we need to understand that the same God of the Old Testament is the same God in the New Testament.
Yes.
So if we agree that the same God in the Old Testament is the God in the New Testament, you may find that there are things that the same God of the Old Testament spoke about in the Old Testament, and he did not speak about them again in the New Testament. Why? Because he knows I spoke about it. So there are other realities that are there within the Old Testament and the New Testament. In the New Testament, they are silent, but they are still a reality.
Yes.
So maybe for it to be clear, I need to explain that the division between the New Testament and the Old Testament, as we have it in the Bible, the inspired scripture, we have Genesis to Malachi being the Old Testament, and we have Matthew to Revelation being the New Testament. It has to be clear that the Old Testament ends with the book of Malachi, and the New Testament starts with the book of Matthew. The reason why the New Testament starts with the book of Matthew, not after the death, I'm saying it starts. I'm not saying it gets into force. It starts. So the word testament is the word that can also be used as will. There are others who translate the same word testament to mean a will. So a will, like that will inonyorwa kana munhu achingafa akunofa kana kuti ari mupenyu anongonyora, then paanozofa it will then be used. That will does not come into existence after the death of the owner akainyora. It comes into existence by him writing it, but it then comes into force after his death. It becomes enforced when he dies, but existing, the lawyers will ask you, do you have a will? And then you say, no, I have a will. After you die, then they will withdraw that will. So which means it existed during your lifetime. So as Jesus was on earth, as he was living on earth, he was actually writing his will. So the New Testament starts when Jesus ceased to be a mystery. In the Old Testament, he was a shadow. He was concealed. But in the New Testament, he is revealed. So the revelation of Christ starts when Mary conceives him. The moment Mary conceived Christ ceased to be a heavenly figure into a humanity figure, to a figure that is in the world, in the earth. Though he was in the womb of Mary, but he was no longer a mystery. Mary knew, I'm carrying a baby. So that's where the New Testament starts. That's why you find that we have that division. But it is enforced after his death, like what the book of Hebrews say. So when I'm talking about the New Testament and the Old Testament, I'll be looking at the book of Matthew as the New Testament going forward, and the Old Testament ending with the book of Malachi. So now, from your question, that there are things that are mentioned from the book of Malachi going backwards, which many people are saying, because I did not see it in the New Testament, we should not do it. One can actually say, I'm not seeing where tithe is written or where seed offering is written, so we should not do it. But there are things that we need to understand when it comes to the Old Testament and the New Testament. The Old Testament carries the foundations. The New Testament carries the reality, the manifestation, the house. For example, let me use the illustration of a house. When you are building a house, you dig the foundation. And Mochera foundation.
Yes.
Mochera foundation. If I call you as a lay person to say, can you tell me the shape of this house? as you are looking at the heaps of mud and everything, you can't tell that the structure or the shape. You can't tell how beautiful the house is. Why? Because it's not yet clear. But when the structure has been raised and there is a roof and everything is there, you can then tell, oh, this is what it was. So the Old Testament carries a lot of foundations, but the realities of those foundations, we see them in the New Testament. Now, if we look at the foundations that are there in the Old Testament, we have some of them which are still continuing, which Jesus did not alter. I call them foundational realities. They are a reality as they are. God did not talk about them again in the New Testament, but he left them from the time he spoke about them in the Old Testament, and he said, deal with them like that. For example, the seasons that we have. Seasons were defined in the Old Testament. They are not defined in the New Testament. If you go to the book of Genesis chapter number 1 verse 14, I think I have to read it.
Yes.
It says, and God said, let there be lights in the firmament of the heaven to divide the day from the night. Now already we now have day and night.
Yes.
So in the New Testament we did not hear Jesus coming to say, so the day shall be defined by this. We are having it as it was.
Yes.
So which means if we are to look at the relationship between the Old Testament and the New Testament, we need to know what is it that we are dealing with. If we are dealing with foundational realities, we carry them as they are. So with these foundational realities, we have issues to do with the seasons, issues to do with the feminine. He created them male and female. We are still having male and female kids being born. Whatever zvimwe zvatakuzoita dzaanharo dzekuti magender mamwe anonzwana others dzangovawo naro.
Yes.
But the foundations are still there. Pasati pacreatwa any other. And we also have the other foundational realities that are there. Anechekuita ne the administration of the church, the administration of families, how families are run, is there in the Old Testament. So if you go to the book of Genesis, it's called the book of beginnings. So a lot of things began there. There are a lot of things that were laid there which God did not speak about again in the New Testament. So if you are to say whatever was not written in the New Testament, we are not going to do it, you will lose out on a lot of things. Why? Because still there are things that you will still do. When it's night, you will sleep. It was spoken in the Old Testament and you are sleeping. And when it's day, you wake up. The sun is still marking the beginning of the day and the end of the day, like it was said in the Old Testament. So we need to understand that those fundamentals or those foundations which were laid, they cannot be altered now that we are in the New Testament. Christ did not come to alter them. Or if you look at it, let me read for you from the book of Matthew. Matthew chapter number 5, it must be verse number 17, where Jesus addresses the issue of the law.
All right.
Yeah, Matthew chapter number 5, let's go to verse number 17. Let me read it. Think not that I am come to destroy the law or the prophets. You get that word? So we have New Testament believers that are destroying what Jesus himself did not destroy. He's saying, I did not come to destroy it.
Yes.
So, but you'd find within the Old Testament, there are things that he came to perfect, to bring out the perfect state of those things, like the typological foundations that are there. The typological foundations that are there, when he came as the reality, the typological elements ceased to operate because he was now the reality. The reality has come. But the realities of other foundations, they still stand as they are. Let me give you a good example. The tithing issue. I know it's an issue to many.
Yes.
And I've seen that many are getting confused when it comes to the issue of tithing. Tithing is an administrative reality that was laid by God in the foundations. That when you are running a church, or as the church is running administratively, tithing is one tried and tested method which God himself ordained. So there was no need for Jesus to come and start talking about a foundation that he spoke about in the Old Testament. So some of those realities, you realize they have been laid without any alterations, and we take them as they are. another good example is worship as we have it. In the New Testament, there is nowhere where we find Paul writing, when you stand in church, you need to be having cymbals, you need to be having this. But do you know where we find that? It's in the Old Testament.
Yes.
So it's easy to find somebody using worship as it is in the Old Testament, but rejecting administration as it is in the Old Testament. So those foundations, some of them, they have nothing to do with the salvation of men. They have everything to do with the administration of the church. Auende kugena nokuti auna kubvisa tithe.
Okay.
Auende kudenga nokuti wachibvisa.
All right.
It's an administrative principle. It's a law that God ordained, and you find that those things which run from the Old Testament to the New Testament, there are plenty. And for your own information, Jesus himself, he would quote other things direct from the Old Testament as they are. You remember when he was tempted by the devil? I think it's the book of, let me go into it. Luke chapter number 4.
Okay.
Or even from Matthew we can get it. Chapter number 4. Jesus quoted Deuteronomy chapter number 8. When he said, it is written, men shall not live by bread alone. That is a Deuteronomy scripture. And that is right in the depth of the law. Jesus quoted the law as it was, and he applied it as it was. So you find that if we are to understand the New Testament and the Old Testament, we need to know that they are not coming to fight. The New Testament did not come to fight the Old Testament, but it came to perfect or to bring out the structure of that house which you are not seeing. You know, when it was a foundation, you cannot see the beauty. But now that Christ came and he is the reality, you can now see. But now, will you be able to say, I want to delete the foundation, let me remove the foundation now that the house is finished? No. We still need, I don't know, I've spoken a lot.
Yes. I'm listening.
Is it? So, there is need for the church of today to know that some of the things that are being referred to as new truths, I would call them that. You know, I've got one brother of mine who used to say, these are new truths. These new truths, they are actually opposing the reality of Scripture, the solid state of Scripture as we have it. The Old Testament and the New Testament, they complement. We have the Old Testament bringing the foundations, and we have the New Testament bringing the realities. You see, so I think we need to handle the Scripture that way. We need to handle the Scripture that way. And now, maybe to make it clear, I just want to point out something. Every New Testament believer is obliged to know the Scripture from the Old Testament or in its whole entirety. You are not supposed to separate, to say, I have nothing to do with the Old Testament, I only run with the New Testament. This kind of teaching, it's a heretic teaching which was once refuted by the councils. Like there was the Council of Nicene, there was other big councils that which addressed these heretic teachings. So when people are seeing them mushrooming now, they appear like they are new, but they are still the same old heretic teachings. But I think in our next session, I would want to touch further on the issues to do with those elements which most of the people are saying we don't do them in the New Testament because they are not written. So as I have proved to you that the same God who spoke in the Old Testament is the same God who is speaking in the New Testament. So there are things that he can choose not to speak about again because they are still there in the New Old Testament. So we read them and we understand them from there. I think I'm done.
Okay, all right. Thank you, Pastor. So, ladies and gentlemen, that was it from Pastor Brighton Mapokotera from AFM. So, if people want to get in touch with you, where can they find you?
We are found at Ebet Chitepo between 2nd and 3rd. It's called Faith Ministries, or Faith College, Faith College. That's where we are. And we are under AFM of Zimbabwe. And We meet from 9 o'clock to 12 o'clock every Sunday.
Okay, thank you so much for coming in. All right, that was it from me. Thank you.